to Washington Talk. I'm Connie Kim, filling in for Eun Jung-cho. President Trump says that he thinks Chairman Kim Jong-un would like to make a deal and that he would also like to make a deal with Kim. North Korea says their position in implementing the June 12th joint statement has not changed and called on the U.S. to change its approach. Can the two sides find a common ground?
Chairman Kim would like to make a deal, and I'd like to make a deal with him. I look forward to seeing him at the appropriate time.
In the studio with me today, Ambassador Alexander Vershbow, Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council. He was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO and also served as U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea. Also joining me, Mr. Mark Fitzpatrick, former Executive Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies Americas. He also served as Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nonproliferation at the State Department. Welcome to the studio.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Ambassador Vershbow, I want to start with President Trump's recent comments about how he thinks that Kim Jong-un wants to have a deal and that how he also wants to have a deal. Are you expecting momentum for talks again?
Well, President Trump doesn't want to admit that the talks are at an impasse, and he still wants to convey a friendly message to Kim Jong-un. But I don't actually see any real momentum for negotiations building right now. The North has given ultimatums. I don't think the United States is going to yield to an ultimatum, and certainly not going to back down on its big deal approach that it laid out in Hanoi. And at the same time, I think the North Koreans are hoping in vain that the U.S. is going to soften its position on sanctions relief through public exchanges in the media. So I see the deadlock continuing. I'm not sure when it's going to end based on the current positions of the two sides.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, do you expect momentum for talks from President Trump's comments?
No, we actually have negative momentum right now, if there's such a term. I mean, North Korea's testing of a short-range ballistic missile was just coming up to the edge of what had to be considered a provocation. The United States is taking firmer steps itself to enforce sanctions. We'll be talking about that, I think, later in this program. So I think for the next few months, both sides are going to be saying things and doing things to try to put pressure on the other side, and that may last until maybe the end of the year.
Mm-hmm. And President Trump keeps on emphasizing the good relationship that he has with Kim Jong-un. How do you think President Trump's messages, these kinds of messages, are going to play into leading up to another meeting with Kim Jong-un?
Well, I think that his friendly messages may give the false impression to Kim Jong-un that Trump wants a deal more badly than appeared at the end of Hanoi, and that he may, if they engage on a personal level, Kim Jong-un may get a better deal than was offered at Hanoi. The U.S. needs to send much more consistent messages between people like John Bolton and Secretary Pompeo and the President himself.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Fitzpatrick, Ambassador Harris said that they're ready to proceed in parallel with denuclearization, with concrete measures in order to transform its relations with North Korea. So is the U.S. pressuring the North to come out to negotiations? How did you read that?
Well, I read it not as so much as pressure, but as reminding North Korea of the great deal that they have in store. If they make a big step of denuclearizing, they can have a full-scale economic cooperation with the United States and the peace treaty that they have been asking about. So he's laying out the incentives here. And to say that they're doing it in parallel, I think is important. That's the way diplomacy should proceed. But he left out of the equation any relaxation in the U.S. sanctions. And that really has to be in parallel as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's the major flaw in the U.S. position. Yes, a step-by-step approach is the only realistic way we're going to achieve denuclearization. It's not going to happen in a big bang all at once. And I think peace will take time to build, and it involves building trust and confidence, scaling back military confrontation. But the missing piece in the U.S. position is offering some limited sanctions relief somewhere in the middle of the process so that the North can at least take home some rewards for providing its first steps towards denuclearization. The administration still has an all-or-nothing approach to sanctions relief, which I think is a formula for deadlock.
So, Ambassador, you mentioned easing of sanctions. I want to come back to that point later. But in the meanwhile, North Korea's foreign ministry says that the U.S. has to change its approach and that the fate of the June 12th joint statement is unclear if it continues to push for its anti-North Korea policy. So how can we read into North Korea's statement here?
Well, North Korea is very disappointed, obviously, by what happened in Hanoi and is trying to, let me say, bully the U.S. into softening its position, which isn't going to work. It's certainly not going to work through public ultimatums. So what I think needs to happen is for the North to find a way back to expert-level talks, even informally, to see whether the framework for a mutually acceptable deal, which I think has to be based on a step-by-step approach, can be agreed. The U.S. in that discussion needs to give some indications that the North will begin to get some relief from the sanctions.
If we also look at the statement, it also says that North Korea is ready to implement its June 12th statement. So are they willing to come out to talks?
I think North Korea is willing to talk with President Trump. They're not willing to talk with anybody below Trump. Steve Biegun hasn't had any meetings with whoever his counterpart is supposed to be. Secretary Pompeo has been denigrated by the North Korean media. So, I think North Korea has correctly deduced that they're going to only get what they want, if anything, from President Trump. He's going to be the one to give them the best deal. And sure, they're willing to meet with him. They get a lot out of it, usually.
Ambassador, are they signaling that they're willing to talk to the U.S. again?
Yeah. Well, I agree that they see the best hope for a solution is dealing face-to-face with President Trump. But at the same time, in Hanoi, they realized that he's not gullible, that he did walk away from the table when they overreached and asked for almost complete sanctions relief in return for very modest steps. And they were even vague what those steps were on Yongbyon. So, but I don't think they've given up on President Trump because he continues to project this very conciliatory line. But they're not going to really get back into the game unless they engage with Steve Biegun and the experts to see whether a mutually acceptable approach can be worked out.
Mm-hmm. So right now the two sides are in parallel with their stance on getting a big deal and the North pushing for a step-by-step deal. So how do we find a common ground here and move forward with the negotiations?
Well, I think that Steve Biegun has talked about this publicly, the idea of working out a roadmap which shows what each side will do at different stages of the process. Because denuclearization, purely in a practical sense, can't happen in one stage. There has to be a step-by-step approach, there has to be verification. The same applies to negotiating a peace treaty. You're not going to just sign a document out of the blue. There has to be a period of confidence building, disengagement on the military side. And normalization of diplomatic relations also will take several stages, I think, to play out. You have to add to the mix what are the economic rewards for North Korea as it hopefully will progress someday down the path laid out in this roadmap. So I think there needs to be some kind of expert-level talk to start sketching out such a roadmap, and maybe both sides will realize their positions are not irreconcilable after all.
What is your take, Mr. Fitzpatrick?
Well, I agree entirely with Ambassador Vershbow about the need for a step-by-step approach laid out like that. I think there are some small steps that North Korea can take to try to change the dynamic right now. And I don't mean the negative step of testing another missile, I mean a positive step. It wouldn't be so much for North Korea to follow through on something it's already said it would do. It said it would invite inspectors to confirm that the Pyongyang test site has been closed. Now, that's not a huge step, but having said they could do it, there's an international inspection organization ready to go in, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization. They could go in, they could confirm that the test site has been closed, although they might also confirm that it would be very easy to reopen it. So maybe that's why North Korea wouldn't like them to come in. But I think, for North Korea to take a big step right now would be to seem to be giving in to American pressure. But by taking a small step of something they've already promised, it's not giving in, it's just following up.
But on the point of Punggye nuclear site, President Trump actually walked out of the Hanoi summit saying that North Korea only offered to denuclearize 1 or 2, while he said that there are 5. But wouldn't that take longer steps in order to denuclearize? And wouldn't that be going against what President Trump said in the Hanoi summit?
Look, I think the United States has made an initial demand to denuclearize everything and all the sites in North Korea, but most of us realize that's not going to happen. So let's get what we can and give North Korea a little bit of credit. It's not a big credit, but a little bit of credit if they bring in international inspectors. That would be a useful precedent for allowing international inspectors. And maybe, the next step might be for North Korea to sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Maybe another step would be to follow up with Kim Jong-un's offer to close down Yongbyon and to find out what that means. These would be part of the step-by-step approach that Ambassador Vershbow and I think is what's needed.
Ambassador Vershbow, you earlier mentioned about easing sanctions. Could you further elaborate on the conditions of easing sanctions for North Korea's denuclearization?
Well, I think if the sides can work out a roadmap, it would lay out the kind of quid pro quo that the North would receive at different stages. And that itself would be a tough negotiation. But, for example, if they actually did carry out the complete dismantlement of the entire Yongbyon facility, which would be a quite significant step. It doesn't solve the whole problem, but it's big. I think some significant relief from the sanctions, reopening all the inter-Korean cooperation, perhaps easing some of the constraints on oil imports and coal exports. But to the extent that the U.S. is afraid that the North will pocket these concessions, the sanctions could be lifted with a snapback provision, which would mean that after a period of suspension, the sanctions would come back into effect automatically unless the North had fully delivered on its side of the bargain. So to the extent that the U.S. doesn't want to give anything away for free, a snapback provision could be a useful safeguard.
Actually, a lot of experts are mentioning snapback provisions when it comes to easing North Korea's sanctions these days. So where would the snapback provisions be applied to? Would it apply to denuclearizing Yongbyon, or would the North have to denuclearize Yongbyon first, and then would it apply to other facilities?
Yeah. Well, I think that would be the stuff of negotiation. Since Yongbyon was at least on the table at Hanoi, even if it was a bit vague and seemed like only parts of Yongbyon, that remains a good place to start. Stopping the production of nuclear material, I think, is a start towards reducing and eliminating the threat posed by the North Korea's nuclear program. I think the way that the lifting of sanctions and the snapback provisions could be actually formalized is through a UN Security Council resolution in which we would get Russia and China to sign up to both the incentive but also to the punishment if North Korea doesn't deliver on its side of the bargain.
Before we move on, I want to touch upon the humanitarian assistance that South Korea decided to give to North Korea through UN nations. How do you think this will be effective in moving U.S.-North Korea negotiations forward? What do you think about it?
I don't think it's going to be effective at all in moving forward the denuclearization goal. This is a South-North issue. So what it might be effective in doing is breaking the impasse in South-North talks. The North Koreans haven't attended a meeting at the liaison office for I think 3 months now. There's a complete freeze in South-North relations. So for the South to make this very generous offer, and if the North accepts it and allows it to go in through the World Food Program, I think it would be a good step in at least South-North relations.
What is your take on it, Ambassador?
I agree with that. I think it might have at best a marginal effect on the climate for U.S.-North Korean talks. I think the bigger issues are still where the sides need to find some common ground on the denuclearization. What is the commitment of the North Koreans to that ultimately, and what is the U.S. prepared to provide as the reward for carrying out denuclearization?
All right, we'll leave it here for now and move on to our next segment.
Achieving complete denuclearization of North Korea in a fully verified manner.
To address so-called ship-to-ship transfers, the Japan engaged in continued monitoring and surveillance.
Seven countries, including the US, Japan, and Canada, have come together to better track ships violating UN sanctions. The US, South Korea, Japan defense ministerial meeting underscored the international cooperation to deter and disrupt North Korea's illicit ship-to-ship transfers. What are the limits and effects of tracking down ship-to-ship transfers? Now, Mr. Fitzpatrick, the Trump administration is emphasizing tracking down North Korea's illicit ship-to-ship transfers when it comes to implementing sanctions. Why is this so important to the Trump administration?
This is a very good step because it's something that the United States and its like-minded partners can do by themselves without having the need for universal application. You know, China and Russia are not going to accept any more UN sanctions on North Korea. But concerned states can take steps on their own to enforce the existing sanctions, and that can have more impact in actually impeding the illicit trade.
Ambassador, why is this so important to the administration?
Well, I think the administration wants to show that when it talks about maintaining the maximum pressure on North Korea, it means business. And closing these kinds of loopholes in the sanctions regime, which have enabled North Korea to both export coal and import fuel oil, that these loopholes are going to be closed, and that hopefully will show the North Koreans that a better solution is coming back to the table. I don't think this is meant just to punish North Korea or the North Korean people. I think it is meant to create leverage for negotiations.
And as part of these U.S. efforts, it's been confirmed that the U.S. Coast Guard Cutter Bertholf is now operating in the Yellow Sea. Isn't it unusual for the U.S. military to reveal these kind of operations?
Well, it is unusual, but it's not unheard of. And it didn't say exactly where the ship was going. There are a couple of recent examples. U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton, at the beginning of May, made an announcement that a U.S. aircraft carrier task force was moving into the CENTCOM area near Iran, accompanied by a bomber squad. So this was meant to send a strong signal to Iran. 2 years ago, President Trump, or the White House announced that the Carl Vinson aircraft carrier was going to be moving toward North Korea. Actually, at that time, it was going in the opposite direction, so the signal was muddied. But when you want to send a signal and show resolve, you can talk about where your ships are.
Mm-hmm. And what does it mean for a U.S. Coast Guard ship to be deployed in that area?
Yeah, well, as I understand it, this is not unusual for Coast Guard ships to deploy far away from U.S. shores to work with our Navy to help defend against encroachments on our interests. And I think upholding sanctions is a legitimate and normal mission for the Coast Guard. Sometimes these kinds of movements, as Mark said, are publicized, sometimes not, but the actual activity is not unusual for the Coast Guard.
Mm-hmm. A UN sanctions report pointed out that North Korean vessels are advancing their sanctions evasions technique. How do you assess the U.S.'s effort to ramp up pressure in tracking down North Korea's illicit ship-to-ship transfers?
Well, I think that so far it has been effective, at least in capturing one North Korean ship, which certainly made them angry, and I think demonstrated that evading sanctions is going to get harder and harder. The fact that we've got 6 other allied nations participating, and South Korea is hopefully helping in their territorial waters, as the Ministry of Defense has said, sends the message to the North that these sanctions are going to bite and they better negotiate. It's a pretty simple message.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Fitzpatrick, how effective do you think the U.S. efforts has been in this front?
Well, so far they haven't been very effective, as demonstrated by the report you mentioned by the UN panel of experts on North Korea sanctions. They said that North Korea has massively expanded these ship-to-ship transfers. So You know, sanctions implementation, it's a cat and mouse game. Whenever the cops, the policemen, the world policemen apply new measures, the other side looks for ways to invade them. And North Korea is very well practiced at evading sanctions. They have an advantage because these ship-to-ship transfers take place relatively close to their own ports, so they have a home field advantage. The ocean is massively huge, and it's hard to spot ships. And then it's hard to actually stop them. When the Coast Guard cutter goes up to a North Korean ship, they can impede the transfer of the oil, and maybe the other ship will flee because they don't want to be involved. But the North Koreans aren't going to just give up, and so you could have an incident on the high seas here. We could see some crisis evolving in the months ahead.
Well, I remember a U.S. senior official telling VOA that they acknowledge that it's hard to track down North Korea's illicit ship-to-ship transfers. But at the same time, the fact that the U.S. has to worry about it is significant progress because it shows that it has actually cut down ways of North Korea making money in normal ways.
Certainly, North Korea has lost the ability to carry out the normal kind of transactions. And having to do ship-to-ship transfers raises the transactional costs for North Korea. It's much harder, it's costly, it's time-consuming. So I think overall the sanctions are certainly having an impact, but they haven't stopped North Korea's ability to import oil or to export coal.
Mm-hmm. Well, but the fact that the multinational coalition is coming together to send warships, military surveillance aircraft, I think that's been unprecedented.
Yeah, I think this seven-nation cooperation is a new thing. Of course, the sanctions weren't as tough in the past. Now you need this kind of enforcement. And I think that, yes, it is going to be a cat and mouse game, even with the additional ships, but perhaps the other countries' ships that are being used by the North Koreans will get scared off by the increased enforcement. I mean, they want to be able to, first of all, not lose their ships if they were to get confiscated, as the North Korean ship was. They also want to be able to enter ports and do normal business in different parts of the world, and they could get blacklisted if they're caught red-handed engaging in one of these ship-to-ship transfers. So deterrence may be stronger than the actual capture by the seven-nation coalition.
All right, we'll move on to our next segment. We'll wrap up our segment here and move on to looking at our photo of the week. This week we have a picture of the opening of the mass games. It's considered to be the regime's most important propaganda event, but it's been accused of widespread human rights abuses, especially to children. After this opening, Kim Jong-un has seriously criticized organizers for their wrong spirit in creation and irresponsible work attitude. What do you make of this photo?
I look at these young children and they have these smiles, like false smiles on their faces, and I feel so sorry for them. I've got grandchildren, and I think of if they had been forced to practice mass movements for 12 hours a day for months on end. It is a human rights violation, and we have a picture of it right here. Even though they're smiling, I think they're being tortured.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Ambassador?
I agree that this is just another confirmation of the regimentation and the oppression that is routine in North Korea. I mean, these children may be better off than the ones that are starving in the provinces in desperate need of food aid, but it shows that the population of North Korea is the big victim in North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons, and they can't put such a positive face on it, no matter how much they try with this kind of propaganda activity.
Mm-hmm. I remember reading from a UNCY's report on North Korean human rights that it is a severe violation of children's rights because they're put into training all year long, and their happiness, their health are at risk.
Well, that is ultimately what we hope will happen if we can solve the nuclear issue and begin to open up normal relations and convince North Korea that there's a better way to treat its own people if it really wants to be a stable, prosperous nation going forward.
So when Kim Jong-un criticized the organizers of the games for their attitude, I don't know what that meant. I would like to think that it meant that they were being too hard on the children, but I doubt that he had a child's welfare on his mind.
All right, well, Mr. Fitzpatrick, Ambassador Vershbow, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. That's all for today's Washington Talk, and from all of us here at Voice of America. Thank you for watching. This has been Connie Kim.